Okay. I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm very excited to be with you today to talk about water use on the farm. And before we begin, though, I want to introduce my colleague and moderator, Hannah Hodge with Springfield Community Gardens. And Hannah, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, yes, I will be on this Zoom call to answer any questions that you guys may have. So feel free to enter the questions in the chat. I also want to say that this is a pre-recorded video. So if you're watching this on Facebook, you can still comment on our Facebook or YouTube. You can still comment and we will get to your questions.
Very good, thank you. Okay, I think at this point, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll bring up the presentation. Okay, Hannah, can we see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. My floating meeting controls. Okay, very good. Well, as I mentioned before, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm Patrick Byers, a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm based in Southwest Missouri. And I work primarily with specialty crop farmers, and my program is focused on helping farmers with sustainability and profitability, both in the short term and in the long term. And today's workshop is a partnership with Springfield Community Gardens, and we'll talk more about that here in a moment. The focus of our workshop is water management on the farm. And it's interesting, when you talk with Americans, most Americans, their connection with water begins when they turn on a faucet and ends when that water runs down the drain. But the reality for farmers is that the connection with water is much more intimate, but it's also much more extensive. Water is a precious resource. It's necessary for everything that happens on a farm. And it's very important for farmers to be good stewards of this precious resource. We'll spend the next 60 minutes or so talking about water. We'll talk about ways to manage water on the farm. We'll talk about ways to develop sustainable water management plans. And then we'll talk about some issues that can be present on water on the farm. This is a partnership with Springfield Community Gardens. Springfield Community Gardens is a grassroots organization in Southwest Missouri, specifically in Greene County and Springfield, whose vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. Springfield Community Gardens manages a very innovative network of community gardens across Greene County, and they also have a very innovative farmer development program, a farmer incubator. Anyone who's interested in moving to the scale of becoming a farmer is encouraged to reach out to Springfield Community Gardens to learn more about this program. The other partner in today's workshop is the USDA. Springfield Community Gardens has successfully competed for several grants from USDA that include an education outreach component. And our workshop is part of that education outreach component. I encourage all who are interested in learning more about the USDA to visit their Farm Services Agency, the FSA agency. FSA has an office in most counties in Missouri, and it's the entry point to the programs that are available from USDA to support specialty crop farmers. In particular, I encourage farmers to reach out to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is abbreviated as NRCS. NRCS has the mandate to help protect our natural resources, our water, our soil, and our air. And they have in place programs, some of which are cost share programs, to support practices that do just that. As an example, NRCS has sponsored the High Tunnel Cost Share Initiative for many years, which has been very successful in moving this technology, the use of high tunnels, onto farms in Missouri. Another USDA agency that farmers should reach out to and learn more about is the Risk Management Agency. This agency can help write insurance policies to protect and manage, or to protect crops and to manage risk on specialty crop farms. So reach out to the RMA or the Risk Management Agency for more information. And information on all of these programs and more is available at the farmers.gov resources website. Our goal for today in today's workshop is, first of all, we'll go through some introductory material to kind of set the stage regarding the importance of water on the farm and specialty crops. Then we'll talk about the process of developing a farm water use plan. And as an extension specialist, I always encourage farmers to write things down. If you don't write something down, frequently things don't happen as you had planned. And if you have things written down, that becomes the basis of moving ahead, of your planning, of your goal setting, and of your progress towards those goals. So developing a farm water use plan in written form can be very helpful. We'll talk about water sustainability practices. Then we'll talk about ways that we can understand water quality on the farm. And then we'll finish with some thoughts on water and produce food safety. To set the stage, let's consider that plants are water. A typical plant is 80 to 95% water. And water is critically important in all stages of plant development, from the time a seed germinates to the time that a crop is harvested. And water shortages, certainly early in crop development, can lead to delayed maturity and reduced yields. And then water shortages later in the growing season can definitely have an impact on quality. We may still see adequate yields, but quality can be impacted. And even short periods of water stress, even a period as short as 2 to 3 days, can have a significant effect on marketable yield. And being able to manage water from the standpoint of specialty crop production is critically important, because through the use of irrigation, for example, we can increase size and weight of individual fruit. We can also develop higher quality products. We can prevent defects like toughness, off flavors, poor tip fill, cracking, blossom end rots, and misshapen fruit. So again, water is so important from the standpoint of crop development. And if we take a look at some of the commonly grown specialty crops on the farm here in Missouri, we'll notice that there are differences, of course, in the requirements from the standpoint of water needs. And there are some crops that have small amounts, less amounts of water available. I'm sorry, we're having some issues here with our slides. And then others that have very high requirements. And then we have, if we look at what plants actually require from the standpoint of production, we can see, oh goodness, excuse me for just a moment. Let me revisit my slide presentation here. This will take just a moment.
All good. We can also cut this out.
Okay, I think we will. All right, let's go back to our screen sharing. Okay. Let's turn our attention to a farm water use plan. And what exactly is a farm water use plan? Well, basically, it's a systems approach. It's looking at all of the components of the plan, and it's developing strategies to manage water on the farm based upon that plan. It provides for the beneficial management of water. And when we think about management of water, certainly we're concerned about crops, but many farms have a livestock component, and that's part of the picture as well. And there's a human component, and we'll talk more about that here in a moment as well. And the farm water use plan also recognizes there are constraints. There may be issues related to the physical characteristics of the farm that impact water use. There may be social or governmental issues that have to be taken into account. And there may be issues related to the particular production system on the farm that become part of the farm water use plan. But if we look at it as a whole, again, it's a systems approach towards developing a plan to manage water. Let's go through the parts of a farm water use plan. The first thing to consider is the source of the water. And frequently farms have multiple sources of water. Certainly rainfall is a source that we take into consideration, but frequently we're looking at water sources that are developed specifically for on-farm use. This could be a surface source, such as a lake, a pond, a stream, a river, a spring, or water catchment. It could be a private well, which is drawing on subsurface water. Or it could be a municipal water supply, where water is delivered to the farm by a county, a water authority, or even a municipality. So let's talk just a moment about surface water. Surface water is widely available. and there are ways to capture surface water and make it available for use on the farm. But it is a water source that is more vulnerable to contamination. There's a common saying that we all live downstream, and that to some extent is true. And activities that take place in surface water sources can impact the quality of the water and the uses for which we put that water. For example, looking at the lower right picture, livestock in a stream can be a significant source of contamination of the water as it moves down the stream. And if we look at the picture on the lower left, this is a pond, yes, but it's been unfortunately located close to a septic system, and the pond water has become contaminated because of the septic system activity. So again, surface water does carry risk, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on when we talk about assessing water quality. Another aspect that impacts water quality, surface water quality here in Missouri, is karst topography. In these three outlines of Missouri, the dots represent in the upper right springs found in Missouri, on the left sinkholes found in Missouri, and in the lower right losing streams. And all of these are aspects of the natural environment, but all of these point out the vulnerability, particularly of southwest Missouri, to the contamination of water sources. For example, in the case of a losing stream, this is a stream that is on the surface and then eventually drops below the surface. And if that water is contaminated, it can then carry that contamination into subsurface water. And that subsurface water may then be released later through springs or through wells that are drilled into those water sources. Sinkholes are a primary source of contamination. A sinkhole is a direct communication between the surface and the subsurface water. And water that flows into sinkholes frequently will end up in groundwater. And if that water is contaminated, there can certainly be a risk of contamination of groundwater sources. So we'll talk more about groundwater in a moment, but we can't assume that groundwater sources are clean because of the karst topography that is commonly found in southwest Missouri. Private wells can be an excellent source of water on the farm. It's a water source that is under the control of the farm. The well can be located where it's convenient, and frequently the quality of groundwater is good enough that it can be used to supply potable water. And let's define the term potable water at this point. Potable water means that there is no detectable level of contamination from biological agents, from things such as bacteria, viruses, or parasites. This means that water is of quality that humans and animals can drink it safely. So when we hear the term potable, that means that water is drinking water quality, and frequently a well can deliver that quality water. Now, can we assume that all well water is safe? The answer is no. First of all, it's very important that the well be properly constructed when it is drilled. And the upper picture on the right gives us a cross-section of a properly constructed well. First of all, there'll be an adequate well head. Frequently, the wellhead is elevated above the surrounding ground, and the ground around the wellhead is graded to move water away from the well. The well casing should be intact. The borehole around the casing should be filled with grout. In other words, there should be no way for surface water to move down the borehole and then contaminate the water at the point where it's drawn out by the pump. So again, very important that wells be properly constructed. And if we look at the lower picture on the right, we can see some examples of well heads. Looking at the left, this is a good example with the ground sloping away from the wellhead. The second picture shows a fair example where we have level ground. Most of the water would flow away, but there could still be some risk of water moving down the borehole. And then on the right, we see a situation of poor construction where water is likely to move down the borehole and could contaminate the groundwater. So again, water quality depends upon well construction. And as we just talked about with karst topography, the hydrology of the area in which the well is drilled. And then the third consideration, it is important to test the water in private wells to understand water quality. And certainly you want to keep records of this testing. We'll talk more about this a little bit later on. But very important to have a routine testing program in place with private wells. And then again, it's critically important to protect groundwater resources. We talked about natural hydrology, but certainly human activity can impact groundwater quality. This could be the disposal of household waste through improperly constructed or drained septic systems. It could be improper handling of livestock wastes, pesticides, and fertilizers, which could enter groundwater. And then also a serious situation is underground storage tanks that leak from areas such as where petroleum products or chemicals are stored. So this could be a problem. Landfills too pose a risk, as does the activity of local industry. And then the third common source for water on a farm is municipal water. And this is water that is delivered to the farm. Frequently, this water is delivered by an authority that charges for it, so it can be an expensive source, but the positive trade-off is that municipal water is much less prone to problems. This water is regularly and routinely tested to make sure that it is potable, and in many cases, the water is treated with sanitizers that render it microbially safe. So generally, municipal water is the safest, but it tends to be the most expensive. Now, most farms, as I mentioned before, will have more than one source of water. Frequently, those farms may have a well, and then they may also have surface water or municipal water available for use as well. So when we talk about the water management plan, we have to take a look at all potential sources of water on the farm. The second aspect of the farm water use plan is the actual water uses on the farm. On many specialty crop farms, the largest water use is for irrigation. And this is at all stages of crop production while it's in the field or in the high tunnel. Frequently, there is also the use of water for harvest and post-harvest uses as crops are harvested, handled, packed, put into storage, and then sent to market. There are frequently places along that chain where water is used. Those farms that are diversified and have a livestock component, certainly water is critically important for livestock management. There may be uses from general farm use from the standpoint of water use. So things such as the application of farm chemicals, the washing of equipment, other types of water use from general farm use. And then most farms will also have personal use of water. So it could be household water use, and it could be the use of water to dispose of waste through septic systems or other waste disposal systems. So the water use plan will include all of these, a description of all of these water uses on the farm. The farm water use plan will also include information on drainage. Frequently, when we talk about water use on the farm, we're talking about water use when there may be issues of shortages, but there can also be situations where we have excess water. And it's very important that the farm water use plan takes this into account. Certainly, excess water in the root zone of a crop can damage the root zone of a crop, and it's important that drainage strategies be in place to remove this excess water. Now, on the other hand, it's also very important that, and we'll talk more about this here in a moment, that we develop a plan to maintain water on the farm, and either to put it into storage or have it enter the soil where it can be made available for plant use. Now, the options for drainage include open ditches or tile drains. These frequently are used on larger scale farms, but they can also have a place on smaller scale specialty crop farms. Mole or French drains, which are channels cut into the soil that are then filled with gravel to allow for the movement of water away from areas where crops are produced. And then land forming, the formation of raised beds, berms, terraces, or other types of land structures that help encourage drainage. And we can see in this lower picture here an elderberry planting planted on berms, where the area on the berm will have adequate drainage to protect that crop from excess soil moisture. Another aspect of the farm water use plan is an understanding of water distribution on the farm. Frequently, there is a point source of water on the farm, and it could be a surface source such as a lake or a stream, it could be a well, or it could be the point at which municipal water is delivered to the farm. And that's the starting point of the water distribution system. But on many farms, things get complicated from that point on. There may be distribution to livestock areas, there may be distribution to crop production areas, there could be distribution to a home or to buildings. There could be distribution to crop production structures such as high tunnels. It's important that the water distribution system be accurately mapped on the farm. And it's also important that the water distribution system be regularly maintained and examined to look for leaks and other potential sources of contamination in that system. So very important that the farm water use plan include an accurate map of how that water is distributed on the farm. Water storage is an aspect of farm water use. And when we think about water storage, this is water that is captured during times of plenty and then made available for use when water is in short supply. Now, certainly the distribution system will be part of water storage, but oftentimes we're looking at other parts of the system to capture that water and then make it available when water is in short supply. An example is the soil root zone. And part of water management is soil management. We'll talk more about that here in a moment as well. But a soil that is of good structure and that is biologically active is a soil that can capture rainfall and applied water, hold that water in the soil system, and then make that water available for plants during water deficits. So having a healthy, well-structured soil with adequate organic matter is a critical aspect of water storage. We can also have water catchment, where water is captured off of structures and then stored for use later. And then a common way of storing water on farms is through the use of ponds. We'll not be going into pond management in detail. That's subject matter for its own workshop. But a pond can be an excellent way to capture water on the farm, to store it, and then make it available for use later when water supplies are in a deficit situation. And then finally, we have to look at water release from the farm, because there can be situations where for example, emergency situations, heavy rainfalls or flood situations where water must be released from the farm. But in general, the goal is to hold water on the farm, make it available, and then recognize that some of that water will be released from the farm. If we look at seepage and percolation, certainly there is some water released from the farm through the soil. And this could be seepage through the sides of openings, such as into ditches and that, or it could be percolation through the soil profile as the water heads towards the groundwater. This is also, of course, an aspect of personal use of water on the farm, particularly when we look at ways that water is disposed of and that waste is disposed of in septic systems and other approaches. Evapotranspiration, the loss of water from crops. Again, it's part of healthy crop development. The water is lost from the foliage of the crops, and that water is also lost from the soil surface. Now, we can reduce water release through this approach by the use of mulches and other layers on the soil surface to reduce the loss of moisture from the soil. This can be a very important management strategy to maintaining water in the soil profile. And then, of course, there may be emergency situations where we have to develop terraces or drainage ditches or other approaches to deal with heavy rainfall events or flooding situations. But that, of course, is part of the farm water use plan as well. So before we leave the farm water use plan, as I mentioned, this should be in written form. And we'll, again, just to quickly review, the farm water use plan will include water sources, the way that water is used on the farm, the drainage strategies that are in place on the farm, the distribution of water on the farm from its point source to its eventual use point, water storage, and then water release. Hannah, do we have any questions at this point?
No questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the second part of our presentation, and that is water sustainability practices. I mentioned that water is a precious resource. It is in short supply when we look at the overall scheme of things. Water is in demand from multiple users in addition to agriculture. So it's very important that those of us involved in farming be good stewards of this precious resource. And there are a number of practices that can be instituted on a farm to help maintain this resource. We're going to focus on the first three practices, which are drip irrigation, capturing and storing water, and irrigation scheduling. The other practices that I list here are equally important, but again, they are subject matter for their own workshops, and in many cases, they're looking at overall farm plans and overall farm planning, rather than specifically focusing on water as our workshop today does. But I'll mention them briefly. They include soil management, particularly organic matter management, the use of composts and mulches and cover crops, the use of drought-tolerant crops, the use of dry farming techniques, rotational grazing, if livestock are part of the farm picture, the use of conservation tillage, and the overall practices involved with organic production. All of these are very important from the standpoint of water sustainability. But for our workshop today, we'll focus on drip irrigation, capturing and storing water, and irrigation scheduling. So let's start with drip irrigation. And the reason that we're interested in drip irrigation is that it is a very efficient way to use that precious water resource. Sometimes drip irrigation is called trickle irrigation or micro irrigation or low volume irrigation. Again, these all refer to, again, the delivery of very specific amounts of water at a very precise way to the crop. And if we look at these two pictures, we can see examples. Over on the right, this is an example of a drip irrigation line with a point emitter. You can see the water dripping out of that line. At the lower left, this is an example of a type of drip irrigation line called lay flat, where we have a small slit in the line through which the water is released. But again, in both of these cases, we notice that the water is very precisely controlled as far as the amount that is released and the point at which it is released. Now, some of the pros and cons of drip irrigation. This low application rate is extremely efficient. Compared to overhead sprinklers or other methods of irrigation, you can save 30 to 50% in water use. There is less runoff, there's less evaporation, and the water is delivered directly to the root systems of the crop. It's a very uniform water application rate. If the system is properly designed and the right components are used, the water application rate at the end of a line is very similar to the water application rate at the emitter points that are closer to the water source. So it can be very helpful from the standpoint of maintaining optimum growing conditions, particularly in controlled environments such as a high tunnel. And if we look at that upper picture there, we can see in the high tunnel, we can actually see the wetted spots where the irrigation system is delivering water very precisely. It's also a useful tool to protect and enhance yield and quality. Drip irrigation systems can also be used to deliver materials in addition to water, soluble fertilizers, for example. Drip irrigation is helpful from the standpoint of disease and weed control. We're not watering non-crop areas, so we don't encourage the growth of weeds, and this system doesn't wet the upper part of the plant, which is a helpful aspect of integrated disease management. It also allows the farmer to continue working in the field while the irrigation is operating. For example, looking at that upper picture of the high tunnel, we're irrigating that crop, but we could also be working in that crop as well. And this is generally not as convenient with other forms of irrigation. Some other aspects of drip irrigation, it allows for solid set management. The system can be put in place and left in place. There are different types of emitter spacing, so we can accommodate a drip irrigation system to the characteristics of the crop. And we can also set the system up so it very precisely delivers water to parts of a planting and not to other parts. And this is helpful, for example, in crop rotations where we may not be interested in irrigating a crop as we approach harvest, but that same crop in a younger stage of development does require watering. And it's also a useful way to irrigate high tunnels where there may be portions of the high tunnel cropping area that don't need to be watered and other parts that do. It works very well with plastic mulch. The drip irrigation system can be placed, the laterals can be placed under the plastic mulch and the water delivered very precisely. It also is helpful to moderate labor because drip irrigation systems can easily be automated with timers that turn the system on and off. Now on the con side, drip irrigation is not effective in frost protection. We can use a sprinkler type system to protect some crops from frost by applying water to those crops during cold days and cold nights. This is not an option with drip irrigation. The emitter points are tiny with drip irrigation, and these are vulnerable to plugging. And plugging can be caused by impurities in the water, both physical impurities, chemical impurities, and biological impurities. So substances such as iron, calcium, sand, algae, some types of fertilizers. And as we'll see here in a moment, it's very important to make sure that the water used for drip irrigation is of good quality. And the drip irrigation installation is vulnerable to damage from rodents and from equipment. You have to be cautious working around the components of a drip irrigation system because they are vulnerable to damage from both hand tools and tools that are mechanized. There are some advantages to combining into an overall system drip irrigation with raised beds and plastic mulch. And this is a very common way that vegetables are produced on farms of any scale here in Missouri. This particular approach allows soils to warm up faster in the spring. We're able to conserve soil moisture by applying water only into the raised bed area where the root system of the crop is confined. We can manage nutrient leaching by very carefully applying nutrients through the drip system. Weeds are managed around the crop plant. There can still be weed issues in the areas between the rows, but the production bed, weed management is excellent with this type of an approach. We can see earlier maturity and improved soil drainage with this strategy. We can see better fruit quality and quantity with the drip irrigation component of a raised bed plastic mulch covered production system. And as mentioned earlier, this system can be very effective in closely monitoring and managing fertility. We can inject fertilizers as needed through the irrigation system on a strict schedule and in specifically monitored amounts. Let's take a quick look at a typical layout of a drip irrigation system. And this is important, especially if a person is new to especially crop production, because you'll hear these terms, and as you work with irrigation professionals, you'll want to understand the terminology. Typically, as we see over on the left side, we begin with a water supply. And again, this could be municipal water, it could be a well, or it could be a surface water source. There may be a pump needed to pressurize the water. These systems tend to be low pressure systems, but they do require pressurization. There will be filtration at some point in the system. And then there'll be pressure regulation. Frequently, water supplies are delivered at a higher pressure than is necessary for the operation of the drip system. And it's important that the pressure be regulated to a point where it doesn't damage the system. So hence the pressure regulator. Water then moves out into what are called main lines. These are the water distribution lines that we discussed earlier that take water to the field or to the high tunnel or to whatever point where the water is going to be delivered. Once the water arrives at the point of delivery, it then enters what's called a manifold. And the manifold is the portion of the system that delivers water to multiple rows or multiple beds. And then connected to the manifold are laterals. And the laterals are the part of the system that actually deliver water to the crop. Along the length of the laterals are the emitters, the points at which water leaves the system and is delivered to the crop. So again, to review, we start with the water supply. We move through the control area that includes filtration and pressure regulation. It may also include a controller that turns the system on and off. The water moves into the main lines. The water moves to the manifolds. It moves down the laterals and is released for crop use at the emitter. And again, we can see these areas highlighted here, the control area. Looking at the control area, some of the components that are present, and we'll go through this fairly quickly. We start out with the flow from the water supply, and in this case, it's a well, and the water is being delivered to the control assembly. We then have a shutoff valve to turn off the water from the water supply. And this is helpful if we need to do any work or repair work on the control assembly. A very critical aspect of a irrigation system or a control area, and for that matter, for any area of water use on the farm, is backflow prevention. And here we see that it's incorporated early into the control assembly. And this is the part of the control assembly that prevents water from flowing back from the areas beyond the point to the water supply. And this can be a very important way to prevent contamination of a well or the movement of unwanted materials into surface water supplies or even into a municipal water supply. So backflow prevention is critically important and should be part of every water management system on the farm. We then have a timer in place here to turn the system on and off. We have pressure gauges. Pressure gauges are the way that we can monitor the effectiveness of the water flow. And a pressure gauge is helpful to have early on in the control assembly, and also later after the, as we'll see here in a moment, the point where materials might be injected into the system. The pressure gauge tells us if there's any problems with blockage or problems with any of our components within the system, particularly the filters. And again, notice the pressure gauge is placed before the filter and then later in the system, so we can measure the loss of pressure over the filter. And then we have the filter. We'll talk more about filters here in a moment. But a filter is a critical component in a drip irrigation system to help protect water quality and to filter out anything that might cause problems later on down the line. In this particular control assembly, we have a chemical injector where we can inject fertilizers into the system. And as we notice here, there's frequently a reservoir and then a way that the water is, or the fertilizer solution is metered into the drip irrigation stream. Another filter below where filtration, or where the chemicals are injected, the fertilizer is injected to collect any undissolved fertilizers and not preventing them from moving into the system as well. We have a pressure regulator to drop the pressure to the point where it's suitable for the drip irrigation system. An air relief valve, if we ever need to drain the system, the air relief valve can be very helpful from that aspect. A shutoff valve to turn off water leaving the drip irrigation control assembly. And before we leave, one more pressure gauge, as we see there beyond the air relief valve, to give us a clear picture of what the actual pressure is as water moves into the distribution system, the manifolds, and the laterals. So again, all the components of a drip irrigation control assembly. And here we see a kind of a cameo appearance of these different types of components. We see the vacuum breaker, we see backflow prevention, we see the filters, we see pressure regulators, we see manifolds to connect the lateral lines to the manifold connections. We see manifold pipe, we see drip tape, and then we see on-off valves to control various parts of the system. Now, some comments on filters. And again, critically important that water entering a drip irrigation system be of good quality. These systems are vulnerable to clogging. And as we mentioned earlier, there are a number of things that can cause this problem. And the goal or the purpose of filtration is to remove these from the system. And there are three basic types of filters. There's the screen filter, which is just as it's described. It has a screen of small mesh. Usually it's 150 to 200 mesh. This is a rating of the number of openings per square inch. The diameter is based upon the diameter of the control area. The screen may be constructed of slotted PVC, or it could be in metal, stainless steel, or nylon mesh. And then typically there is a way to flush the filter, which is part of maintaining it, to remove any contaminants. And it could be manual, or it could be set up on an automatic flush. Then we have disc filters, and these are constructed of stacks of grooved wafers. And the disc filter is widely used. We can see in that lower picture an example of a disc filter. Unfortunately, disc filters don't handle sand very well. And so if sand is a concern in the water source, then it's probably better to use a screen filter, or to use the third type, which is a sand media filter. In a sand media filter, there is a reservoir that is filled with sand, and water is run through the sand under pressure. And then again, this is typically number 16 silica sand, which is the equivalent of 150 to 200 mesh screen. And then this system works best at lower volume flows. And typically, if a sand media filter is being used, it's followed with a screen filter to catch any sand that might accidentally move out of the filter into the system. And sand filters are backflushed to clean. I mentioned fertigation, the opportunity to inject fertilizers into the drip irrigation system. And this can be a passive type situation where water is set up as we see in the system is set up as we see in the upper left-hand picture, where we have a differential of pressure across a U, and the water is then drawn into the system, or it can be active using injection type pumps. And we can see several of those here in this picture. Manifold operations. Once water arrives at the high tunnel or the field, then it's important to have a connection between the manifold and the laterals, which actually deliver water to the crop. And there are different ways that this can be done with barbs or with fittings. And frequently, valves are placed on each lateral line. And we can see this in that lower right picture there, where we can actually turn off each individual bed if desired. So again, one of the positive aspects of a drip or trickle system is we can very precisely place the water where we want it. And we can turn the system off if we don't want water in a particular area. And then, of course, the drip tape itself, the actual lateral line that delivers water. In line source, drip tape is frequently used in annual vegetable production. And this is drip tape that has different thicknesses of wall. Commonly, we see 6 to 8 mil drip tape used. There is heavier drip tape that can be used in stony sites, for example, where there might be more risk of damage to the drip tape. Frequently, drip tape is intended for only a 1 to 2 year life. It can be installed in the surface or it can be installed under the surface. The emitter spacing is manufactured within the tape wall. We can see here that there are different spacings, typically at 2 to 4 inch intervals. And the typical spacing is based upon the characteristics of a crop. For example, with a direct seeded crop such as arugula, the closer spacing would be indicated than, say, for something like okra, which is planted on a much wider spacing. And we can see that we have different operating pressures for different types of tape based upon the thickness of the wall. And for example, with 6 mil tape, which is commonly used, 10 psi, 10 pounds per square inch is the common pressure. With a thicker wall tape, such as 15 mil, this can be a higher pressure, 25 pounds per square inch. This type of a lateral is vulnerable to animal damage. So it has to be regularly inspected and maintained to take care of any damaged areas. As mentioned, the drip lines can be placed on the soil surface. They can be placed under the soil surface. A frequent placement is on top of a raised bed, but under a plastic mulch. And again, we can see in these diagrams several examples of placement of drip tape. Okay, Hannah, at this point, before we move into capturing and storing water, do we have any questions?
We don't have any questions. I did want to ask you, in regards to the different filtration types, are you familiar with Berkey filters?
No, why don't you share some information on that?
Berkey filters, they're charcoal filters, and it's a drip system. So it's, I believe it's a pressurized drip system. So it's purely based on weight, but it removes 300 different contaminants from just regular tap water. We use ours here, but it's interesting. I never thought of doing different tiers of filtration. Like it is really necessary.
Yeah, exactly. The type of system you're describing would be very helpful in a situation where you need potable water, as we'll talk about here in a moment, and you don't have a ready source of potable water available. Typically on a larger volume system, such as a drip irrigation system, the types of filtration you're describing would be quite expensive. So when we talk about the type of filtration, oftentimes we're looking at the economics of the system as well as the effectiveness. But again, the use of the type of system you described would be very helpful, for example, with harvest and post-harvest water, where that water needs to be of drinking water quality.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Any other questions?
No questions.
Okay, let's talk now about the second aspect of sustainability and water management, and that's capturing and storing water for use later. And as I mentioned earlier, a properly managed pond can be a very effective way to capture and store water. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about ponds because, again, we'll likely have a workshop on that coming up in the future. But some things to consider: the pond needs to be properly sited so that runoff is efficiently captured. It also needs to be properly constructed so that it holds the water once it enters the pond. And this can be a challenge. There are many locations where, because of hydrology or soil characteristics, it can be difficult to construct a pond that holds water. Now, there are some practices such as the use of bentonite clays and other types of materials that can be spread on the floor of the pond, which will help with maintaining water in the pond. It's important that we consider the use of biofilters, basically grassy areas around the pond, to filter out potential contaminants as the water enters the pond. And you can see in this picture here, the farmer has maintained a grassy area around the pond. And it's also important to maintain the pond so that we don't introduce contaminants. For example, fencing livestock outside of the pond can be a very important aspect of keeping the water in the pond in as good a quality as possible. And NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, has a number of practices and programs in place to help maintain water quality in ponds. And I would encourage those with an interest to reach out to their FSA, their Farm Services Agency office, and visit with NRCS about some of these practices that could be in place to help with pond management. Another thing to consider is that unless the pond is extensive in size, there is a limit to the amount of water that it will hold. And there needs to be provision for overflow from the pond. And it's important to recognize that the amount of water that is stored in the pond is not infinite. And frequently when water is most needed for irrigation or other farm purposes, the water supply in ponds will be dropping. So yes, ponds can be an important part of capturing and storing water, but oftentimes they are only part of the overall farm water supply, particularly in times of extreme drought. We're seeing lots of interest in rainwater catchment, and for good reason. Rainwater catchment goes hand in hand with the adoption of practices such as the use of high tunnels. The surface of a 30-foot by 96-foot high tunnel, we can capture 900 gallons of water off of that surface during a half-inch rain. And so even during fairly minor rainfall events, we can capture a lot of water off of the surface of something such as a high tunnel or a large building. And so this resource can be captured and used. Typically, the components of a catchment system are, first of all, some sort of gutter collection system. This could be along the tops of the sidewalls of the high tunnel, or again along the eaves of a building. And then the water is channeled to a storage area. And frequently these are tanks that are plastic or some other material of varying sizes. And the size of the tank is based upon the irrigation needs of the system. And it should be recognized too, before we go any further, that rainwater catchment, the water that is captured in this approach, is considered to be surface water, and it carries some of the same challenges that a lake or stream would carry from the standpoint of contamination. And the reason for this is because the surface from which the water is collected frequently is contaminated. And so this water has to be considered as surface water. And then once the water is in the storage tank, then we need some way to move it from the storage tank to the point at which we plan to use it. Rainwater catchment is most efficient when it's paired with drip or trickle irrigation. As we look at this diagram here, we can see the components with the gutter. In this case, the system is connected to a high tunnel. Then we have a delivery point from the end of the gutter into the storage tank. We have an overflow that allows excess water once the tank is full to then leave the system. We have a steel stake to anchor the storage tank, and then we have provision, it can't be clearly seen in this diagram, but a pump system to move the water out of the storage tank. And these pumps can be electric or they can be solar powered. There is an excellent resource from NRCS on rainwater catchment from a high tunnel for irrigation. I encourage everyone to take a look at this. And we have a companion video that I would like to show at this point describing a rainwater catchment system on a high tunnel. So at this point, let's go ahead and bring up the video. Okay, Hannah, can we see the video here?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, go ahead and turn it on. And Hannah, do we have good audio on this?
So why put rain gutters on a high tunnel? Well, we find that when the rainwater rolls off the roof of a high tunnel, you frequently get wetness problems along the edge of the tunnel that seep back into the tunnel. There are erosion problems, all kinds of problems with that extra water. Besides that, you can harvest that rainwater and use it back in the tunnel. And in studies, we've found that you can get a significant portion, maybe more than half of the water needs for the crop in the tunnel served by that rainwater. So we did a rainwater collection system on a high tunnel we had at one of our research farms. I'd like to show you how we installed that system. The system is comprised of 3 parts. Basically, we have the gutters to collect the water off the roof. We have storage tanks to hold that water until we can use it, and then a pumping system to reuse the rainwater inside the tunnel. Mounting the gutters onto a Quonset-shaped high tunnel means we're mounting on curved sides. In order to get the gutters closer to level, we needed angled mounting boards. We ripped 2x4 planks lengthwise at an angle so that we could have a beveled mounting board to mount to the side of this curved arch frame on our Quonset-type high tunnel. The beveled mounting boards were attached to the high tunnel frames underneath the tarp on the inside of the high tunnel. We used simple conduit or plumbing type straps to attach the angled mounting boards to the tunnel frames, using short construction screws to attach the clamps to the board. A string line stretched from one end of the high tunnel to the other gave us a line to follow in mounting the boards on the tunnel frames. The string line had to be pulled out a little bit so it would clear all the frames as it went from one end of the tunnel to the other. And we set the string line at the slope that we wanted the gutters to follow in the end, about 6 inches of drop from one end of the tunnel to the other. This guide allowed us to align the mounting boards. Vinyl gutter brackets were then attached to the mounting board from outside, screwing right through the tarp of the high tunnel into the mounting board. The gutter sections are connected with gasketed slip joints. These joints must be located in the proper spot for the sections to come together. Measure that distance and locate the slip joints, allowing for the expansion and contraction of the vinyl gutters. Follow the manufacturer's recommendations for the gap that you allow. A string line on the outside of the tunnel helped us to align the bottom of the mounting brackets and the splice brackets as we mounted the brackets to the wooden mounting board. Once in place, following the string line, the gutter brackets formed a nice uniform slope from one end of the high tunnel to the other. We recommend 6 to 8 inches of slope in 100 feet of gutter on a high tunnel. Vinyl gutter sections are inserted into the gutter brackets, and the brackets are clipped over the top of the gutter to hold it in place. This type of system makes it easy to remove the gutter sections. For example, in the wintertime in our climate, we'd like to pull the gutter sections off so that ice and snow sliding off the roof of the tunnel don't tear up our gutter. Here's the finished gutter in place with 6 to 8 inches of slope from one end of the high tunnel to the other. You can see it's not a straight line looking down the edge of the tunnel because the frames aren't that perfectly uniform, but we do have a nice uniform slope from one end to the other. An end cap is placed on the high end of the gutter. This cap has a gasket built into the cap. It's simply snapped over the end of the gutter and ready to go. On our high tunnel, there were straps over the top to help control wind billowing of the roof of the high tunnel. We made sure to install the gutter sections underneath those roof straps so that they didn't interfere with the installation of the gutters. When installing the gutter sections, make sure to leave the recommended gap between the gutter sections as you install them into the slip joints. To get rainwater off of the roof and into the gutter, we needed a flap attached to the tunnel roof. This flap is just a piece of roofing material that we attached to the tunnel to get the water off of the tunnel roof and inside the gutters. The rain flap can be attached under the wiggle wire on the hip board, or we found it easier to simply tape a short flap to the tunnel roof using roof repair tape. When taping the rain flap to the tunnel roof, you may have to work around the brace ropes that hold the roll-up sides on the tunnel in place. Cutting the tape around these ropes may help to avoid leaks that you would get from water running behind the ropes and the tape. Wind may blow the rain flap around on the side of the high tunnel. It may be necessary to weight the bottom edge of the flap to hold it in place. Many types of weights may work on the bottom edge of the rain flap. In this case, we found that a number 9 wire threaded through holes punched in the bottom edge of the flap held it down inside the gutter. We also tried fishing weights, and any other type of weight that you can attach to the bottom edge of the flap might work. The second part of the system includes tanks for storing the rainwater. Because our system has 2 water tanks, we had to make sure that the water tanks were at the same level so we could connect the 2 tanks together and not have one tank flowing over into the other tank and overflowing the top of one of the 2 tanks. So the first thing we had to do in setting those tanks was to make sure the pads were at approximately the same level for the 2 tanks. Providing a smooth surface for the tanks to sit on was important for support. You could use fill sand, you could use fine crushed rock. In our case, we used limestone screenings, which are even finer than road rock. They were easy to pour out on the pad and smooth off with a plank just to get a nice level surface. Once our pads were in place, we put the tanks on the pads, making sure that we aligned the tank with the line that the gutter would form as it came off the end of the high tunnel. It's important to use clean water tanks for rainwater capture because this water is going to be used on the crops inside. We did not want to have old tanks that had been used for pesticide storage or transport. The gutter directs rainwater from the high tunnel to the storage tank at the end of the building. A drop from the gutter fills the tank. To avoid overfilling the tank, a ball valve made from a toy inflatable ball rises to seal off the gutter drop. As the ball floats up, it seals against a sewer adapter on the end of the gutter drop. Extra rainwater bypasses the full tank to an overflow downspout and away from the high tunnel. A wire basket holds the ball in place inside the tank and keeps it positioned just below the gutter drop. A flexible water line brings rainwater from the tank into the high tunnel. Our 2 tanks are connected to the pump using a Y valve so we can draw from either or both tanks. A 200 mesh filter protects the pumps and the drip irrigation system. Because collected rainwater contains bacteria, use it only for drip irrigation and never on the surface of produce or for any other use. We used electric diaphragm pumps to send the water from our storage tanks to our drip irrigation system. Pumps can be run with AC line power or with solar panels. Solar panels could be rigid and mounted on a mounting board, or they could be flexible panels, as seen here, attached directly to the roof of the high tunnel. In a solar system, a deep cycle storage battery stores power from the solar panel for the system. A solar charge controller maintains the battery at proper charge level and prevents overcharging or bleeding of power. The battery then stores the power and runs a DC diaphragm pump. In our system, we have switches to operate either an AC pump or a DC pump to send water to the irrigation system. The pumping system feeds pressurized rainwater through a pressure regulator and to the drip irrigation system. A companion publication titled Rainwater Catchment for a High Tunnel for Irrigation Use is available from the ISU Extension online store. The publication number is PM3017 and it's available at this address.
Okay, do we have any questions about rainwater catchment?
No questions at this time.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move back to sharing our presentation then. Hannah, did the audio come through okay on that video?
Yeah, it was great.
Okay, excellent. And again, just to highlight that video is a companion to the publication Rainwater Catchment from a High Tunnel for Irrigation Use, which I found to be a very useful resource for anyone who's considering on-farm rainwater catchment. Now let's talk about scheduling irrigation as another aspect of sustainable water management. And there are different ways to schedule irrigation, but the goal of scheduling irrigation is to provide water when it's needed before plants are at a point where they are undergoing water stress that it affects the way they grow or the the yield or quality of the harvested part of the crop. There are different ways to do this. Some of them are more accurate than others. Some of them are more precise than others. Others are more of a general observation, but these approaches include, first of all, looking at the appearances of plants. When we start to see temporary wilting, this is usually a good indication that it's time to start in irrigation. The feel method, where we actually examine the soil to get a feel for the amount of moisture in the soil. The screwdriver method, a very basic method, but actually quite effective. The calendar method, where we look at just basically scheduling irrigation based upon what day of the week is. We irrigate every third day, or we irrigate every Monday and Friday. The checkbook method, where we look at rainfall and irrigation as deposits into the checking account, and we look at daily water use as withdrawals. And when the balance of the checkbook reaches a certain point, it's time to start putting more deposits in. And then we have instruments, tensiometers and moisture resistance blocks, which actually measure the level of water in the soil. So let's take a look at each of these. So again, appearance of plants. When we begin to see temporary wilting, when we begin to see color changes in the plants, if it's in the case of a lawn or something, if you walk on it and you can see footprints, it's time to start irrigating. But again, this is not a particularly precise way of scheduling irrigation. And if we're not out there making observations every day, we can actually miss the early signs. And by the time we turn on the irrigation, we can actually have experienced stress to plants. So although it's useful, it's not particularly precise. The feel method, where we can evaluate moisture levels in the soil by the characteristics of the soil, can be helpful. And this is a skill that we developed by practice. We basically take a sample of soil into our hand. We compress that into our hand. We look at how readily it forms a ball of soil. We look at whether or not it leaves a layer of moisture on our hand. And then we squeeze it out between our fingers as a ribbon. We can get a feel for that as well. There are excellent videos to help guide the becoming good at using the feel method. The screwdriver method, basically we look at rainfall, and then periodically we're going to check soil moisture with a long 10-inch screwdriver. This can be either a slot screwdriver or a Phillips, and we push it into the ground. And it's time to irrigate if we experience significant resistance to the screwdriver going into the ground. Again, and not a particularly precise method, but one that can be used to get a rough idea of when it's time to irrigate. The calendar method, the argument against the calendar method is that it doesn't take into account accurately naturally occurring rainfall or changes such as temperature changes, windfall, the other things that influence the loss of moisture from plants. And so, yes, it can be helpful, but it's not, again, particularly precise. The checkbook, or the soil water balance method, is a good way to schedule irrigation, but it does require record keeping. For example, for this to work, we have to have a recording of naturally occurring rainfall and also the applications of water from irrigation. And then we have to have a way to estimate water loss from the crop, that evapotranspiration that we mentioned earlier, which is loss of water from plants and loss of water from the soil. And then we also have to have a feel for the growth stage of the plant, because plants have different water requirements based upon their growth stages. So to give an example, looking at tomatoes, with tomatoes, we have most of the root system of the crop in the upper 12 inches of the soil. If we're working with a clay loam soil, we know that it has a water holding capacity of about 1/3 of an inch of water per inch of soil. And then we, typically in that top 12 inches after a soaking rainfall or a thorough irrigation, we have about 1.8 inches of water stored in that 12 inches of soil that is available for the tomato crop to use. And then if we know from experience that during the midsummer, during June, July, and August, the loss of water from the soil and from the tomato crop is going to be about 1/4 inch per day. That's called ET, or evapotranspiration. And these, this is the starting point of our checkbook. And so we start from a point where we know that we have stored that 1.8 inches of water in the top 12 inches of the soil. And then we begin to subtract the ET. every day we subtract a 1/4 inch from that 1.8 inches. If we get rainfall, we add that back in. If we irrigate, we add that back in as well. But at some point, our balance is going to get close to 0, and that's the point where we need to start irrigating. And again, here's an example of how we would keep that. Let's say that we have a 2-inch rainfall on day 1. We set the balance at 0. Our water withdrawals are 0. And then we don't get any more rainfall for several days. And each day we subtract a 1/4 inch from that balance. And so by the end of the 4th day, we're down to 0.75. We're not down to 1.8. So we don't have to turn the water on yet at this point, but we're down to 0.75. On day 5, we get another nice rainfall, a 1/2 inch. We subtract that 1/2 inch, or we actually add that 1/2 inch to the balance. And now we're back to a situation where you have a 0.25. And then we, again, keep tracking our 0.25 water withdrawals. At the end of day 10, if we haven't gotten additional rainfall, we're up to a negative balance of 1.75, which is getting dangerously close to our 1.8. At that point, we turn on the irrigation and we apply enough water, the equivalent of about 2 inches of water, to reset the balance to 0. And then we have instruments that give us a direct reading of the level of moisture in the soil. A good example is a tensiometer. A tensiometer really measures the energy needed to extract water from the soil. It's a sealed plastic tube that has a cap at the top for sealing and then a vacuum gauge attached to the column. And the tube is filled with water. Any air in the tube is pumped out, and then it is sealed. And then water is lost through the porous ceramic tip. And the drier the soil is, the stronger the pull of water out of the tube. And the strength at which the water is being removed from the tube is measured on the vacuum gauge. And we know from experience that when the vacuum gauge reaches a particular level, it's time to turn on the irrigation to, again, add more water to the soil system. And here's an example. Again, record keeping is important. Tensiometers have to be regularly monitored. In this case, we're looking at high tunneled strawberries. And we know that when our tensiometer reading reaches about 30 centibars, it's time to turn on the irrigation. And we can see that point will be reached at different points depending upon characteristics of the soil. And we learn about this by using the tensiometers, gaining experience and understanding the characteristics of our soil. So again, we can see here that that 30 centibars point is reached fairly quickly on sandy soils, which don't hold a great deal of water, but less quickly on a loam soil, which holds more water. And again, this points out the importance of drought-proofing soils by adding organic matter, because we make the soil more capable of maintaining moisture. Electrical resistance sensors can be used as well. And these are if we look at the unit there on the left, this has a porous ceramic tip. It's placed in the soil, and then it's connected to a voltmeter, which actually measures the resistance of current across that ceramic tip. In a wetter soil, there's less resistance. In a drier soil, there is more resistance. And we can get a good feel for the level of moisture in the soil by measuring the electrical resistance. It's more or less a permanent installation, and these can be placed at different depths, just as tensiometers can be placed at different depths to get a feel for what is going on in the profile of the soil. And again, we can see some examples of these different types of units here. In the upper left, we see tensiometers installed. In the lower left, we see moisture sensors where we're getting ready to place these into the raised bed. In this case, it's a tomato crop, and we'll place the sensors in the root zone of the crop. Okay, do we have any questions at this point on ways to schedule irrigation, Hannah?
There are no questions at this time.
Okay, let's watch a quick video from NRCS on water sustainability practices.
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and we'll bring up the video. Okay, can we see the video?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Let's go ahead and
Organic farmers rely on healthy soils and dependable water sources to grow their food. In fact, agriculture accounts for nearly 80% of our country's consumptive water use, which makes how we use water a critical natural resource issue. The USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service can help farmers with effective irrigation water management plans tailored to their farm's specific needs. NRCS helps farmers and ranchers conserve water with plans that increase their soil's water holding capacity, using conservation tillage and mulching to keep the ground covered and reduce water loss through evaporation. They also promote organic practices that create biodiversity by using crop rotations and cover crops to build soil organic matter. And it adds up. A 1% increase in soil organic matter on a single acre can help the soil retain over 20,000 gallons of water, water that can be banked and made available when plants need it most. And NRCS agricultural engineers can use satellite tracking tools to conduct precise topographical surveys. These can help them to design a complete irrigation system, from well to pumps to pipes to hookups out in the field. They can also help farmers automate their irrigation needs using tools like wheel lines. These manage cropping systems that require different amounts of water throughout the year. Or they can use approaches that combine conservation principles with efficiency, using tools like drip irrigation to put water precisely where and when it's needed, in the root zone. And tools like soil moisture sensors to monitor the effectiveness of these systems to reduce overwatering and nutrient losses. They can help develop irrigation management plans that preserve wildlife, using technology to pump stream water into nearby storage tanks during off hours so that farms can meet their daily irrigation needs without compromising spawning grounds for local fish. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, helping organic farmers balance their land's water needs with those of nature. To learn more about irrigation water management plans, drip irrigation, soil organic matter, soil moisture sensors, and conservation tillage, contact your local NRCS office, where they can help you help your land organically.
So cool.
Yes, that is an excellent video, again, highlighting some of the practices we just talked about, but also highlighting the NRCS commitment to helping manage and preserve our water resources. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I encourage farmers to reach out to your local NRCS conservationists to help develop plans for your farm and to take advantage of the programs that are in place to support these sustainability practices. Do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
No questions.
Okay, let's go ahead and return to the presentation then. Okay, is the presentation back up?
Yes, it appears as though there's a black bar across the screen, but then it goes away.
Yeah, that's the meeting controls, and they go away, thankfully. Okay, well, let's turn our attention to understanding water quality, because as we've seen, water quality is certainly going to impact how we're able to manage and use water on the farm. And we'll start with physical and chemical characteristics. And some of the things that we're concerned about are related to the water source. You know, there can certainly be issues, as we saw earlier, with surface sources and contamination, but even with well water and municipal water, there can be issues that we want to be aware of. So if we take first a look at well water, generally well water is of good quality, but there can be issues with the chemistry of well water, particularly pH and hardness. There can also be dissolved substances in well water that will come out of solution and can cause problems in drip irrigation lines. Municipal water is generally quite clean, but some of the agents used to treat municipal water may be of concern. Municipal water, of course, is expensive as well. Surface water sources such as springs, rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, these frequently carry issues that have to be dealt with through filtration. And there can be biological contaminants in these water sources as well. We oftentimes get questions related to pumping water into tanks on hills and allowing for gravity flow out of those tanks. And this can be one way to accommodate the lack of pressurized water on a farm, but typically it's of limited use because you have to have a lot of change in elevation between the water holding area and the area where the water is used to develop much pressure in the system. So that is a limitation as well. Now, when we think about water quality analysis from the standpoint of chemistry and physical contaminants, first we look at inorganic solids, and these could be sands or silts, and frequently surface water sources will carry some load of inorganic solids. We can also have organic solids. These might be algae or bacteria or slime. They can certainly have a negative impact on the use of water in a drip irrigation system, for example. We can also have dissolved solids. These could be carbonates based upon calcium. They could be iron and manganese, or they could be sulfates and chlorides, all of which can affect the quality of water. And if they come out of solution, can pose a risk of clogging components of the water distribution system and certainly drip irrigation systems. The pH can be a problem as well. pH can negatively impact the use of that water for purposes such as farm chemical sprays or fertilizer injection. A preferred pH is 5.8 to 6.8. Back up to dissolved solids, ideally we'll have less than 500 parts per million of dissolved solids in the water. And then hardness is a concern as well. And in an ideal setting, we'll have less than 150 parts per million of hardness in a water source. This information is from the Soil Plant Testing Lab at the University of Missouri. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. But this lab can conduct what's called a domestic suitability test, which measures hardness, pH, nitrate N, sulfate, chloride, sodium, carbonate, bicarbonate, iron, manganese, copper, electrical conductivity, and total dissolved solids, all of which is very important, useful information in understanding the quality of a water source. So farmers are highly encouraged to submit water samples to get a feel for their water quality relative to chemistry and to solids. Now, again, if we look at the plugging potential for drip irrigation systems related to these factors that we just described, if there are suspended solids and we have more than 50 parts per million, there's a moderate risk of clogging and a severe risk if we have more than 100 parts per million of suspended solids. And then looking at our chemical characteristics, we'll just pick out pH, for example. If the pH is above 7, moderate risk for plugging. And if the pH is above 7.5, a severe risk. Looking at iron, if we have more than 0.1 part per million, we see a moderate risk. If it's greater than 1.5 parts per million, a severe risk. So it's important that water, particularly water for drip irrigation, be tested to get a handle on what these various characteristics are in that water. And if there are problems, then to address them. And we're not going to go into detail in how to address these situations. I encourage anyone with concerns about water quality to reach out to your county University of Missouri Extension office for connection with an ag engineer who can advise on how to address any water quality issues. Again, troubleshooting can be helpful, and if any of these symptoms show up in a water distribution system, then frequently we can track down what the cause is. So green or slimy matter in surface water, this is likely algae or fungi. Turbidity or muddy water, this is an indication of suspended clay and silt in the water. If we note a white precipitate or a film that is on our lateral tapes or around emitters, this is carbonate precipitation. If we see reddish brown precipitate or slime around emitters, this is iron precipitation. If the water is initially clear, but it turns red or orange when it's exposed to air, this is water that is carrying a dissolved load of ferrous iron, which then, upon exposure to oxygen, comes out of solution as ferric iron. If we see black sandy particles, that's iron sulfide. If we see a black precipitate, this is manganese. If we see a reddish brown slime near emitters, this is bacteria that are feeding on iron in the water. And white stringy masses of slime, this is bacteria feeding on sulfur that is in the water. We can oftentimes note water quality issues too, not just by physical appearance, but also by the smell. And particularly levels of sulfur in the water can be indicated by the smell. As mentioned, the University of Missouri maintains a water testing lab, and the publication EQ100 is an excellent overview of water testing and the procedures that are in place at the water testing lab to evaluate the quality of water. And farmers are encouraged to regularly test their water using the University of Missouri Water Testing Lab to get a handle on chemistry and physical characteristics of that water. Hannah, do we have any questions about water testing at this point?
No questions.
I will mention that at present, the cost of a basic water test from the standpoint of physical and chemical testing is $35.
That's not bad at all.
No, that's not bad at all. Very reasonable price. It's also important to understand biological or microbial characteristics of the water. And we touched on this earlier with the discussion of algae, but we also need to be concerned about potential health risks associated with water quality. And this, of course, relates to things such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites that might be present in a water source. And again, the only way to understand microbial water quality is by water testing. And water quality must be matched to the intended use. You know, for example, if that water is to be used for irrigation, where the irrigation water doesn't contact the part of the crop we're going to harvest, there is a lower standard from the standpoint of microbial quality. But if that water is going to be used, for example, to wash a crop after harvest, or if it's going to be used for household use, then it must be potable, a much higher standard of water quality. And the only way to understand water quality is through testing. And some notes here on potable water. On the farm, potable water is necessary for domestic use. Anytime humans are going to consume water, it's also necessary for livestock. You know, livestock, it's important that that water be potable for drinking purposes. And then if we're using that water for harvest and post-harvest use, to wash crops, to cool crops, to wash our hands that are going to contact crops, this water must be potable as well, must be of drinking water quality. Now, to turn our attention to produce food safety, it's sort of a natural movement from the discussion of biological contaminants into produce food safety. There are a number of organisms that can make people sick that can be present in water sources on the farm. And certainly bacteria such as Salmonella, E. coli, Shigella, Listeria have been implicated in foodborne illness outbreaks. Also viruses such as norovirus and hepatitis A, and then a number of parasites such as Giardia, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, and Toxoplasma have all made people sick. And all of these microorganisms can be present in the water on a farm. In Missouri, an excellent resource for microbial water testing is the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services Water Testing Lab. And the publication that's noted here is Water Sample Collection Instructions. The entry point to the Department of Health and Senior Services Lab is through the County Health Department or the County Health Services. And there's an office in every county. The office will provide a water testing kit, which includes the water testing bottle and clear instructions on how to sanitize the collection point, how to properly handle the bottle, how to collect the water sample, and then how to submit that sample for analysis. And there is a window of time in which that sample must be submitted. So it's very important to follow the procedure correctly so that the water test report that comes back is accurate. At the present time, a basic test for potability is $10. There are also programs in place that can allow for a more precise test looking at E. coli levels in water from the standpoint of produce. And so those can be requested as well. Now, again, some comments on produce food safety. It's important to understand where that water will be used in the produce operation. Is it strictly for use in irrigation, or are we going to use it in harvest, post-harvest handling? And what can we do to reduce the potential contamination? It's all about risk management when we focus on produce food safety and water interactions on the farm. Agricultural water is the water that we use to actually grow crops. And this is water that is also used for again, delivery to the field, for irrigating crops. We have to recognize that this agricultural water can carry and spread pathogens. We can have a point source of contamination which can be quickly spread to an entire field. So understanding water quality is very important. Certainly in production water with irrigation, crop sprays, and frost protection. Certainly too in post-harvest water, where we're using water to cool or wash or move crops, and for cleaning areas and washing our hands. And then, of course, there's the unexpected event, the risk of events such as flooding or runoff, which can carry problems with them as well. But again, that interface between water and produce food safety is very intimate on the farm. We have to understand that relationship, and we have to understand the quality of water that we're using on the farm. So if we think about the risks associated with production water, the water that we're going to use to actually grow crops, first of all, we think of the source of the water. We think about the way that we apply the water, secondly, and third, the timing of the application. So the source, of course, we've touched on already. Is it a public water supply? Is it groundwater? Or is it surface water? The application method, are we applying that water through a drip system where the water doesn't contact the part of the crop we're going to harvest, say in the case of a crop like blueberries, for example? Or are we using an irrigation method that does throw water onto the part that we're going to harvest, such as a sprinkler? Obviously, if we don't hit the part that we're going to harvest with irrigation water, the risk is less. And then the timing of application. If we're using water that is carrying some load of contamination close to harvest, that carries a higher risk than if we're using it earlier in the production cycle. We recognize that the pathogens that make people sick that are found in water do die off over time, especially in the field environment. But the longer period of time that we allow for that die-off, the lower the risk. Hence the idea of using cleaner water as we get closer to harvest. So again, just back to review, public water supplies are the safest water supplies from the standpoint of produce food safety. They are treated in many cases and they're regularly tested. Groundwater that has been tested to be demonstrated to be safe is next from the standpoint of risk. The highest risk is associated with surface water, which is assumed to carry some load of contamination. How much? We don't know without testing. Application methods. Overhead irrigation can be okay for produce food safety and for water conservation, but again, recognize anytime that we wet the part of the crop we're going to harvest with irrigation water, an understanding of the quality of that water is very important. Trench or furrow is better. There is still risk of splash from trench or furrow irrigation, but drip or trickle is the best, and especially if it's combined with a plastic mulch or some other type of mulch, it is the best risk management practice from the standpoint of the interface between irrigation water and produce food safety. The timing of the application. If we look at this lower picture here, we see a sweet corn farm where we're still well out from harvest and we're using an overhead system of watering. But as we move closer to harvest, it's important to carefully consider irrigation water quality. And in fact, if there's an option to switch to potable water as harvest approaches, this is an important risk management practice. It's important to test all water sources. Now, we mentioned that municipal water is frequently tested by the authority that's delivering that water, and it's in the farmer's interest to obtain copies of those tests. Wells and surface water sources must be tested. Surface water sources frequently are more rigorously tested, perhaps with multiple tests each growing season. With a well, typically a single test is suitable to understand water quality. I have some information here on actual levels of microorganisms that are allowed in water relative to Food and Drug Administration guidelines. And for more information on that, please reach out and we can share information specifically on how these levels, what's called the geometric mean, which is a more or less average of contamination compared to the statistical threshold, which is a high point. And then from the standpoint of water that's used at harvest and post-harvest and for domestic use, the water must be potable with no detectable generic E. coli per water sample tested. It's important that farmers understand their water distribution system because, again, any leaks or breaks in the distribution system can introduce contamination into that system. And even if the farmer is using municipal water that is delivered to the farm in potable form, that water can be contaminated in the distribution system on the farm. So annually, the water distribution system should be examined closely for leaks or other potential contamination sites, and any risk points should be corrected. And then from the standpoint of water that is used during harvest and post-harvest activities in produce food safety, this is a critical point because at this point, the crop is concentrated and it's very easy for contamination to spread to a large part of the harvest. And this, of course, is a serious issue for farmers. At this point, all water must start out as potable. If possible, don't wash produce unless it's necessary. And if you're reusing water, we see this lower picture here with the summer squash and the large tank of water. If we're going to be using that water for several batches of produce, it can be a helpful risk management practice to use a sanitizing agent in that wash water. And again, for more information on the use of sanitizers or for the whole aspect of post-harvest water use, please reach out to your local University of Missouri Extension office for more information. So at this point, Hannah, do we have any questions relative to produce, food safety, and water?
No questions at this time.
Okay, so in conclusion, I hope that our time together today has pointed out the importance of a farm water use plan and the different parts of that plan. It's very straightforward to put that together, but a very useful situation, a very useful practice for farmers to have a good handle on their farm water use. It's important to institute water sustainability practices. As I mentioned, practices such as drip irrigation, water catchment or water storage, and the use of irrigation scheduling can be very important aspects of being good stewards of the water on a farm. Important to understand water quality, and basically what this means is that water sources should be tested regularly. And then from the standpoint of produce food safety, it's very important to understand the intersection between both production water and harvest post water in growing and marketing safe crops from our farms. I do want to mention that we have a winter vegetable production conference that will be coming up in 2021 that will be virtual. We'll be working with 4 evenings in the early spring. We'll be doing 4 case studies that highlight farms that are extending the season with winter production. And again, be sure to check out the Web City Farmers Market website for details, and that website is listed here. It's also very easily found with a Google search for Web City Farmers Market. And at this point, Hannah, do we have any questions on the material we've covered today?
We have no questions at this point.
Well, very good. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us at the workshop. If you have any questions moving ahead relative to water use on the farm, please reach out to your local University of Missouri Extension office or reach out to Springfield Community Gardens. And there are resources that are available at these offices that are focused here on our conditions here in Southwest Missouri. It can be an excellent way to also develop a relationship with an extension specialist who can be a useful resource for you in your farming operation. So again, I want to thank Springfield Community Gardens and the USDA for supporting our workshop today.
Yay, thank you, Patrick. This has been
Thank
great.
you very much, Hannah. Thank you very much. Okay, well, let's go ahead and just continue sharing here. Okay, so any thoughts on the workshop today?
I think it's really relevant, especially in regards to Californian farming.
Oh my
the
goodness,
lack of
yeah.
water.
You all are definitely a touchstone from the standpoint of water issues related to farming.
Yeah, but it's also interesting, you know, surface water. Surface water in Missouri, it was always a concern for me when canoeing, especially with like cattle that have fallen into the river and stuff like that. You know, what is that, Current River? One time I went canoeing and we were told that upstream there was a dead cow in the water.
Well, yeah, so Current River is a good case in point. There is, you know, for example, a lot of people put into the Current River there near Van Buren. And if you go upstream from Van Buren, not too far, there is a huge operation set up there with horses, you know, for trail rides and things like that where those horses have access to the river. And that's just such a tricky situation. And you're right.
And I wonder how Tyson and those, I forgot what the other production facilities are in, what is that, Monette or Aurora?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how their water practices are. I wonder if they
actually they're actually pretty good, and that is because there is a legacy of problems there, and you know, they've been called to task, and they have vastly improved their management of water, especially as it leaves processing facilities. So yes, that's I think a pretty good situation at present.
Are there regulations and are there laws set in place for if you were caught dumping water, like dumping into the water?
Oh, certainly. Here in Missouri, that is regulated through the Department of Natural Resources.
Uh-huh.
And there are certainly laws in place, regulations in place. Also, you know, I want to, give kudos to NRCS and also our soil and water conservation districts for their support of practices. For example, fencing livestock out of surface water sources can be huge. Now, you know, if you're a farmer and you've got a pond, you need to use that pond water to in livestock situations. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do that through the use of systems that actually move the water away from the pond to an area where livestock can access it, rather than, you know, climbing into the pond itself. So,